October 30th, 1942. 1,615 hours. The Eastern Mediterranean, roughly 70 miles north of Port Said. A German submarine, forced to the surface after 10 hours of relentless depth charging, wallows low in the water, her crew scrambling up through the conning tower hatch and into the sea as British shells crack overhead to discourage them from manning her deck gun. Alongside her, boats from the British destroyer HMS Petard close in, and two men go over the side and swim toward the sinking hull rather than away from it. First Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier strip off what clothing they can and dive into the submarine through her conning tower hatch, into a hull filling with water in near total darkness, searching by touch for anything that looks like paperwork, code books, charts, a machine with typewriter keys and a lampboard bolted to a table in the radio room. What they find in the next several minutes, and pass up through the hatch to a 16-year-old canteen assistant treading water above them, will do more to shorten the Battle of the Atlantic than any single naval engagement of the entire war. Neither Fasson nor Grazier will survive the attempt. This is the story of an ordinary destroyer, a routine anti-submarine patrol, and the 4 minutes that broke open Germany's most secure naval code at the exact moment Britain needed it broken most. The crisis Petard's crew did not know they were about to help solve had been building for almost a full year. By the autumn of 1942, and it was a crisis measured in ships sunk faster than Britain and the United States could build replacements. Since the start of the war, the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park had been reading a meaningful proportion of German naval radio traffic encrypted on the three-rotor Enigma machine, a code-breaking effort built on the earlier work of Polish cryptologists and driven forward by British mathematicians and cryptanalysts working in HUD 8 under Alan Turing and, from late 1941, Hugh Alexander. That intelligence, distilled into the intercept product known as Ultra, had allowed the Admiralty's submarine tracking room to reroute convoys around known U-boat concentrations with real, if imperfect, success through 1941 and into the first weeks of 1942. Then, on February 1 Street, 1942, the German Navy introduced a fourth rotor to the Enigma machines used specifically by U-boats operating in the Atlantic, a modification the Kriegsmarine had been developing in secret and rolled out fleet-wide within days. A network the Germans called Triton and the British, once they understood what had happened, came to call Shark. Overnight, Bletchley Park's window into U-boat operations went dark. The additional rotor multiplied the number of possible machine settings by a factor of 26. Transforming a code-breaking problem that HUD 8's bombs. The electromechanical machines built to test Enigma settings at speed could usually crack within a day or two into a problem that, for most of 1942, they simply could not solve at all within any time frame that mattered operationally. The Atlantic convoy were during those blacked-out months turned catastrophic. Allied merchant shipping losses climbed through the spring, summer, and into the autumn of 1942, at a rate that naval planners on both sides of the Atlantic understood, with grim clarity, could not be sustained. British and American shipyards were launching new merchant tonnage faster than at any point in either country's history, and German U-boats, operating with confidence in the North Atlantic corridor precisely because British convoy routers could no longer see them coming, were sinking that tonnage faster still. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat arm, referred to the period as a time when his boats operated almost entirely free of the intelligence disadvantage that had constrained them earlier in the war. Winston Churchill later wrote that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the entire conflict was the U-boat peril, and it was precisely during these blacked-out months of 1942, with Shark unbroken and convoy losses mounting, that the peril came closest to justifying that fear. Bletchley Park's cryptanalysts had not given up on the Shark problem through 1942. They had simply run out of the raw material needed to solve it through pure mathematics alone within useful time. Breaking any version of Enigma, three-rotor or four-rotor, depended on a combination of captured code material, known plaintext patterns called cribs, and above all, sheer computational grinding through the bombs at Bletchley and, from later in the war, at a growing complex of outstations. The specific documents that would make the difference for Shark were not the Enigma machine's rotors themselves, which German cryptologic security assumed the British could never physically capture in any usable quantity, but two much smaller, more mundane-looking items. The short signal book, known to German operators as the Kursignalheft, a codebook that allowed U-boats to compress routine sighting and weather reports into extremely brief coded bursts of only a handful of letters before encrypting them on Enigma, and the closely related short weather cipher, the Wetterkirschel cell, used specifically for meteorological reports. Both books, if captured intact and current, would give Bletchley's cryptanalysts exactly the kind of known plaintext crib they needed to attack the far larger four-rotor problem mathematically, because a short, formulaic weather report, once its underlying plaintext structure was known, dramatically narrowed the possible machine settings a bomb run needed to search through. British naval intelligence understood this in theory well before October 1942. What they had never yet managed to do was capture a set of these documents from an operational U-boat quickly enough, and intact enough, for them to still be current and useful before Germany's regular code-changing schedule rendered them obsolete. The submarine that would inadvertently provide that material, U-559, was in most respects an entirely unremarkable boat, and that unremarkability is itself part of what makes the story that follows so improbable. She was a Type Viec, the most numerous class of German attack submarine built during the war, roughly 220 feet long, displacing around 769 tons submerged, armed with 4 bow torpedo tubes and 1 stern tube, and crewed by a complement of around 44 to 52 officers and men depending on the patrol. Commissioned in February 1941 under Kapitänleutnant Hans Heitmann, U-559 had by October 1942 completed several patrols in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, sinking a modest handful of Allied merchant ships. Entirely typical performance for a mid-war type Viec boat operating in a theater that, by late 1942, was becoming increasingly dangerous for German submarines as Allied anti-submarine capability improved. There was nothing in U-559's design, her crew, or her operational record up to that point that marked her out in any way as a target of unusual intelligence value. She carried the same standard Enigma machine, the same category of short signal book and weather cipher that every other operational U-boat in the Kriegsmarin's Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets carried in October 1942. What made her different was not the submarine at all. It was the accident of exactly where and exactly how she happened to be sunk. Before we get into the engagement itself, if you're finding this deep dive into U-Boatto history, trench history, interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. On October 30, 1942, U-559 was operating south of the Mediterranean shipping lanes running toward Port Said and the Suez Canal, a critical logistical artery supporting the British 8th Army in its campaign against Rommel's Afrika Korps, a campaign that, by late October, was reaching its decisive phase at the Second Battle of El Alamein. A British escort group built around the destroyer HMS Petard, a P-class fleet destroyer of roughly 1,540 tons standard displacement, armed with 4 4-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes, along with the destroyers Hero, Dulverton, Pakenham, Herworth, and Belvoir, together with supporting aircraft from RAF squadrons based in Egypt, picked up a submarine contact and began what would become an extended, grinding hunt lasting roughly 10 hours through the afternoon and into the evening. Petard herself, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mark Thornton, was in most respects as unremarkable a warship as U-559 was an unremarkable submarine. a standard fleet destroyer of a class built in considerable numbers to a proven, workmanlike design, intended for exactly this kind of unglamorous escort and anti-submarine duty, rather than any more celebrated role in fleet actions or gunnery duels against enemy capital ships. Thornton, however, had developed something of a personal preoccupation with the specific tactical problem of forcing a submerged U-boat to the surface rather than simply sinking her outright with depth charges, reasoning correctly, as it would turn out, that a submarine captured or forced to surface intact offered vastly more intelligence value than one destroyed cleanly on the seabed, and he had reportedly drilled his crew specifically with this outcome in mind in the weeks before the October 30th engagement, an emphasis that would prove decisive in the hours that followed, though at the time it registered as little more than one commanding officer's particular tactical preference rather than any officially sanctioned doctrine. The hunt itself unfolded across the afternoon in the pattern that had become grimly familiar to escort crews throughout the Mediterranean and Atlantic by late 1942. Sonar contact, a run-in to drop a pattern of depth charges, loss of contact as the disturbed water and churned wreckage or debris confused the hunting ship's own listening gear, a period of searching to reacquire the submerged contact, and then another run, repeated as many times as the hunting destroyer's fuel and depth charge stocks allowed. Over 10 hours, Petard and her companion destroyers subjected U-559 to a sustained pounding that, while never scoring the single decisive hit that would have simply destroyed her outright, progressively damaged her hull, her systems, and her crew's ability to keep the boat operating submerged. By the early evening, with her batteries running low, her depth-keeping systems damaged, and successive depth charge patterns causing worsening leaks throughout the hull, Heitman made the decision that every U-boat captain dreaded, and that Thornton's tactical approach had been specifically designed to force, rather than risk his boat's structural failure at depth. With the near certainty of losing his entire crew, he ordered U-559 to surface and abandon ship, opening the seacocks and vents to scuttle the submarine as her crew climbed out through the conning tower hatch into the water. What happened in the roughly 20 minutes that followed the surfacing of U-559 has been reconstructed from survivor accounts, from the recollections of Petard's own crew, and from the subsequent official recognition awarded to the men involved, and it stands as one of the most consequential improvised actions of the entire naval war, precisely because none of it had been planned or ordered in advance. As U-559E's crew abandoned ship into the water, Petard closed in, her gunners firing to discourage any attempt by the remaining Germans to man the submarine's deck gun or scuttle her more completely, while Thornton, recognizing immediately that a submarine still afloat, however, briefly represented an intelligence opportunity that might never come again, ordered a boarding party away. 2 officers and men, First Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, swam across to the sinking submarine and climbed in through the open conning tower hatch, descending into a hull that was visibly filling with water through the scuttling vents Heitman's crew had deliberately opened. In darkness, with no clear sense of how much time remained before the boat went under entirely, what they found below deck, working essentially by feel in a flooding compartment, was the submarine's Enigma machine still bolted to its table in the radio room, along with a substantial quantity of paper documents, codebooks, signal logs, and cipher material stored nearby, exactly the category of material Bletchley Park had spent the better part of a year hoping someone, somewhere, would manage to capture intact from an operational boat before it could be destroyed or lost. Fasson and Grazier began passing books and papers up through the conning tower hatch to a third crew member waiting above. Tommy Brown, 16-year-old NAFI canteen assistant, technically far too young for combat service, and aboard Petard only because he had lied about his age to enlist, who had swum across with the boarding party and now treading water at the hatch, relaying each document, Fasson and Grazier handed up out into a waiting boat. Over several trips, the two men below passed up the short signal book and the short weather cipher, the exact documents Bletchley Park's cryptanalysts needed most, along with other charts and papers from the submarine's control room and radio compartment. Having secured that first critical batch of material, Fasson and Grazier went below again, this time specifically to retrieve the Enigma machine itself, bolted to its table and requiring considerably more effort and time to free than the loose paperwork had taken. It was during the second descent that U-559, her scuttling vents having done their work far more completely than the flooding rate during the first several minutes had suggested, suddenly, and without warning, began to sink much faster, the submarine's bow dropping and the hull filling rapidly enough that there was no longer time for the two men below to climb back out through the conning tower hatch before the boat went under. Tommy Brown, still at the hatch above and closer to the surface, was able to scramble clear as the water rose around him and was pulled from the sea by the waiting boat crew. But Fasson and Grazier, working below deck in the submarine's radio compartment when the final flooding began, went down with U-559 and drowned inside her. Their bodies never recovered. The Enigma machine they had been attempting to retrieve at the moment the boat sank went down with them, lost along with the submarine to the floor of the eastern Mediterranean, roughly 8,200 feet below the surface at that position, a depth well beyond any wartime recovery capability, and, in fact, beyond any capability that would exist for decades afterward. The documents that had already been passed up and out before the final flooding, however, the short signal book and the short weather cipher chief among them, survived intact, were dried and secured aboard Petard, and were flown to Britain and delivered to Bletchley Park within days, still current, still valid for the code period in use, and still exactly what HUT-80's cryptanalysts needed to break open the shark network that had defeated them mathematically for the better part of 10 months. The material's value lay precisely in the formulaic, predictable nature of the short weather reports it decoded. Since German U-boats used the Wetterkirchel cell to compress routine meteorological observations into extremely brief coded transmissions before enciphering them on the four-rotor Enigma, and a codebreaker who already knew, from the captured book, exactly what plaintext a given short weather signal almost certainly contained, gained precisely the kind of known plaintext crib that made an otherwise impossibly large four-rotor search space tractable for the bombs to grind through in workable time. Hugh Alexander and the rest of HUT-80's team, working through November and into December 1942 with this new material in hand, succeeded in breaking back into shark traffic on a regular, timely basis by mid-December 1942, restoring Bletchley Park's window into U-boat operational traffic for the first time in 10 months, at almost exactly the moment the Atlantic convoy battle was approaching its most desperate and decisive phase. The strategic consequences of that breakthrough unfolded over the following months in ways that historians on both sides of the post-war record have judged to be genuinely decisive rather than merely helpful. With shark broken again, the Admiralty's submarine tracking room regained its ability to plot U-boat wolfpack positions from decrypted signals traffic and reroute convoys around known concentrations, precisely the capability that had been lost throughout most of 1942. And whose absence had contributed directly to that year's catastrophic shipping losses. The winter and early spring of 1943 nonetheless saw some of the largest convoy battles of the entire war, culminating in the mid-March engagements around convoys SC-122 and HX-229, in which German wolfpacks, still operating in considerable strength despite Bletchley's restored intelligence, sank a combined total over 20 merchant ships in a matter of days, briefly reviving fears within the Admiralty that the Atlantic battle might still be lost regardless of what ultra-intelligence could reveal. But the restored decryption capability, combined with a rapidly improving Allied anti-submarine order of battle, New centimetric radar, longer-range aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic air gap, dedicated escort carrier support groups, and improved weapons like the forward-firing Hedgehog mortar converged within weeks to produce one of the most abrupt reversals of fortune in the entire naval war. May 1943, remembered afterward within the U-boat arm itself as Black May, saw Germany lose 41 submarines in a single month, a rate of attrition so severe and so unsustainable that Admiral Dönitz, on May 24, 1943, ordered the withdrawal of virtually the entire U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic convoy routes, effectively conceding the Central Atlantic battle that had come closest of any single campaign in the war to starving Britain into defeat. The intelligence chain that made that reversal possible ran directly back through HUT-80's December 1942 break into Shark. And that break ran directly back to a short signal book and a short weather cipher, dried out and flown to Bletchley Park, that two men had passed up through a sinking submarine's conning tower hatch in the final minutes before they drowned, retrieving the machine. Those very documents had been designed to be used with the recognition afforded to the men of Petard's boarding party, when it eventually came, reflected both the genuine scale of what they had accomplished and the peculiar secrecy that necessarily surrounded it for decades afterward, since the entire Ultra program, and Britain's ability to read German Enigma traffic at all, remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and for many years after it, meaning that the full strategic significance of the U-559 boarding could not be publicly acknowledged or explained, even as individual acts of bravery within it were formally recognized. Anthony Fasson and Colin Grazier were each posthumously awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian and non-combat gallantry award in the British honor system, awarded specifically for actions of great heroism performed other than in the actual presence of the enemy, in circumstances of extreme danger, a somewhat technical category that reflected the fact that the two men had died not in combat against an armed and resisting enemy in the conventional sense, but in a desperate, improvised act of salvage aboard a flooding, sinking vessel, a distinction that mattered for the purposes of which specific award applied, but did nothing to diminish the scale of what they had actually risked and lost. Tommy Brown, the 16-year-old canteen assistant who had swum to the submarine alongside them and relayed the captured documents to the surface before the final flooding forced him to escape, was awarded the George Medal, becoming, at the time, the youngest recipient of that decoration in its history, a distinction made considerably more poignant by the fact that the Royal Navy, having discovered, in the course of formalizing his recognition, that he had lied about his age to enlist and was in fact still under the legal minimum age for military service, subsequently discharged him from the Navy entirely, sending a decorated hero of one of the war's most consequential intelligence operations home as a civilian only weeks after the action that had earned him his medal. Brown's later life took a tragic turn unconnected to his wartime service. He died in a house fire in 1945 at the age of 19, having reportedly gone back into the burning building to try to rescue his younger sister, a second act of selfless risk that, unlike the first, cost him his life. The wider significance of the U-559 boarding within the history of Allied codebreaking has grown considerably clearer with time, as the broader ultra-secret itself was gradually declassified beginning in the 1970s, and as historians gained access to the full documentary record of exactly how, and exactly when, Bletchley Park's various breaks into different Enigma networks had actually been achieved. It is now understood, and was confirmed directly by cryptanalysts who worked in HUT-8 at the time, that the material captured from U-559 was not merely helpful to the Shark code-breaking effort, but was, in the specific and considered judgment of the people who did the actual mathematical work, essential to breaking back into four-rotor naval Enigma traffic on the timeline that actually occurred. a timeline that mattered enormously given how close the Atlantic convoy battle came to catastrophic Allied defeat during the exact months the blackout persisted. Other captures of Enigma-related material across the war, most famously the earlier 1941 boarding of the weather ship M'Enchen and the trawler Krebs, and the capture of the submarine U-Boatto by HMS Bulldog's crew in May 1941, which yielded an intact three-rotor Enigma machine and contributed materially to Bletchley's earlier successes against the original naval network, form part of the same broader pattern that the mathematics of Enigma, however elegant and however successfully attacked through pure cryptanalysis at other points in the war, repeatedly depended at critical junctures on ordinary sailors aboard ordinary ships, performing extraordinarily dangerous, entirely improvised acts of physical salvage that no codebreaker, sitting at a desk in Buckinghamshire, could have accomplished on their own. What makes the Petard action distinct even within that broader pattern of Enigma pinches, as the codebreakers themselves came to call such captures, is the near-total absence of any advanced planning or institutional preparation behind it. Unlike some later, more deliberately organized attempts to capture code material from German vessels, the events aboard and around U-559 on the evening of October 30, 1942, were almost entirely improvised in the moment by a destroyer captain who had developed a personal tactical preference for surfacing rather than sinking his targets, and by two crewmen and a teenage stowaway in all but name who, faced with the submarine visibly sinking beneath them in darkness, made the individual decision to keep working below decks for material they had no formal training in identifying or prioritizing. Guided by little more than the general instinct that paperwork and a strange-looking typewriter machine bolted to a table in the radio room were probably worth more than anything else aboard a sinking U-boat, Petard herself received no special citation or lasting fame for the action at the time, precisely because the ultra-secrecy that made the captured material so valuable also made it impossible to publicly credit the ship or her crew with what they had actually achieved. And for decades after the war, the destroyer's role in one of the most consequential single actions of the entire Battle of the Atlantic remained known only to a small circle of naval intelligence officers and the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park who had received and used the material Fasson and Grazier died retrieve. HMS Petard herself survived the war, continuing her Mediterranean and later Indian Ocean service through 1943, 1944, and into 1945, taking part in further anti-submarine operations, escort duties, and eventually service against Japanese forces in the Indian Ocean theater, a routine, largely unremarkable wartime career for a P-class destroyer that never again produced a single action to match the strategic significance of the 20 minutes off port said in October 1942, though her crew, understandably, had no way of knowing at the time just how significant those 20 minutes had actually been. She was eventually sold to the Royal Hellenic Navy after the war, and continued in Greek service for a further 2 decades under the name Navarinen before finally being scrapped in the 1960s, ending her career, much as she had spent the majority of her wartime service, without any particular fanfare, a workmanlike destroyer that had done a workmanlike job across a long war, entirely unaware for most of that time that the single most important thing she would ever do had already happened in a few desperate minutes off the Egyptian coast, witnessed by a handful of her own crew and understood, at the time, by almost no one at all. The broader lesson embedded in the U-559 action, and in the wider history of Enigma pinches, of which it forms a part, runs directly against the popular post-war image of Bletchley Park's code-breaking triumph as a story told almost entirely in terms of mathematical genius, of Alan Turing and the bomb machines grinding through possibility spaces in windowless huts far from any battlefield. That image is not wrong exactly, but it is dramatically incomplete. Because Bletchley Park's ability to read German naval traffic at any given point in the war depended on a continuous, largely unglamorous supply of captured physical material, codebooks, cipher keys, machine settings, and on at least this occasion, the machine itself. That pure cryptanalysis alone, however brilliant, simply could not always generate fast enough to matter operationally against an opponent who changed his procedures and rotor wirings whenever security demanded it. The four-rotor shark network that blacked out Allied intelligence for 10 catastrophic months in 1942 was not, in the end, broken purely through mathematics, working in isolation from the war being fought at sea. It was broken because a destroyer, captain with an unusual tactical preference for capturing rather than sinking his targets, happened to force a fairly ordinary U-boat to the surface at a moment when her crew could not fully complete their own scuttling and destruction procedures before 2 men were already swimming toward her, and because those 2 men, faced with a flooding hull and a closing window of survival, chose to keep working rather than turn back, understanding at some level that whatever they could carry up through that hatch mattered more than the machine's mathematics ever could on its own. Fasson and Grazier never learned what their sacrifice actually accomplished, since the ultra-secret that made their captured documents so valuable remained classified for the rest of both their families' lives and for decades beyond. They died retrieving an Enigma machine they never managed to bring to the surface, having already, without knowing it, handed up the 2 smaller, more ordinary-looking books that would matter infinitely more: an unremarkable destroyer, hunting an unremarkable submarine, on a day that began as one more routine patrol in a war already full of them, ended instead as the moment that broke open the code Britain most needed broken. At the exact hour the Battle of the Atlantic hung most precariously in the balance, through nothing more sophisticated, in the end, than 2 men's decision to keep searching a sinking hull for a few minutes longer than caution or training would ever have required of them.